All right, let's get ready for another deep dive. Today, we're tackling Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law. And this one is going to be a doozy, I think.
It's a powerful book for sure. It
Yeah.
really changes how we think about segregation in America.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's easy to assume that segregation is like a relic of the past, right?
Yeah.
Something that just kind of happened organically.
Right, like people naturally wanting to live near others who look like them or share their cultural background.
Yeah, like birds of a feather flocking together.
Yeah.
But Rothstein argues that it's not some accident of personal preference. He calls this de facto segregation. And instead,
He makes the case that segregation in America was actually engineered by the government.
it was baked right into the law. So
Yeah.
we're talking about de jure segregation.
And the crazy thing is that its consequences are still echoing today.
So it's more than just a history book. It's almost like a legal indictment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He's laying out the case for how these policies violated core principles of equality enshrined in our Constitution.
Now, one of the things that really struck me is how Rothstein connects segregation to the 13th Amendment, the one that abolished slavery.
It's a really compelling argument. He argues that by relegating Black families to inferior housing, inferior neighborhoods, with limited access to good schools, jobs, and resources, it essentially continues a system of disadvantage that's directly linked to slavery.
Wow. Okay, I have to admit that connection isn't immediately obvious to me. Can you help me understand that a bit more? How does he make that link?
Sure. So he argues that even though slavery was abolished in 1865, true freedom was systematically denied to Black Americans through these policies. It's as if freedom was granted, but the opportunity to truly thrive was intentionally withheld.
So you're saying that without equal opportunity, true freedom is impossible.
Exactly. And he backs this up with actual legal history. He points to the 1866 Civil Rights Act, which was passed to enforce the 13th Amendment. That act specifically prohibited racial discrimination in housing as one of the key ways to dismantle the legacy of slavery. So even back then, lawmakers understood that housing discrimination was a direct result of and continuation of the injustices of slavery.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing things didn't go so smoothly from there.
Sadly, no. Rothstein highlights a pivotal moment in 1883 when the Supreme Court struck down crucial parts of that Civil Rights Act. They rejected the argument that housing discrimination was a badge or incident of slavery, which really undermined the law's power.
Oh, that sounds like a massive setback.
It was a major blow. But it wasn't the end of the legal battle. Rothstein walks us through nearly a century of this back and forth in the courts, culminating in 1968 with the Jones v. Mayer case.
Okay.
In this landmark decision, the Supreme Court actually reversed itself, reaffirming that housing discrimination does in fact violate the 13th Amendment.
That's the progress, but after a long and winding road.
Exactly. And this whole legal tug of war really underscores how deeply entrenched these issues are in our legal system and how they continue to be debated even today.
Okay, so Rothstein sets the stage with this powerful legal framework. But how does he actually go about proving that segregation wasn't just some natural occurrence, but a deliberate, systematic policy of the government?
He does it by meticulously dismantling
Hey everyone,
this myth
welcome
of
to our
de facto
deep dive
segregation.
today. You reached out
He
about
presents
Richard
a mountain
Rothstein's
of
book, The
evidence,
Color of
legal
Law.
documents, government
And,
records, historical accounts.
you know,
It all points
really
to a
want to
clear
dig
pattern
deeper
of
into this
intentional
history of
actions
racial
designed to
segregation
keep
in
Black
housing.
Americans separate and
Particularly
unequal.
how the
So he's
government
not
played
leaving
this
any
surprising
room for
role
interpretation.
Yeah.
to get ready to
It was
uncover some
deliberate.
stuff and,
Full stop.
Exactly.
maybe challenge some
He
assumptions.
systematically
because
takes
I
apart
think
this
this will be
common
eye-opening.
notion that
You know, it's
segregation
interesting
just
because I think a lot of people have this
individual
belief
choices
that racial
and prejudices
segregation was
definitely
like,
existed.
you know,
He
just kind of a
acknowledges that,
natural outcome
but they were far less
of
influential in
private
creating these
prejudices,
segregated neighborhoods
individual
than were
choices,
deliberate
this
government
de
policies.
facto
So
segregation.
this distinction
you hear
between de
about.
facto and
Right.
de jure
But Rothstein really
segregation
flips
is
that on its
absolutely
head.
crucial
He
to this
argues that
whole
residential
the
segregation is
foundation.
actually
He uses
de jure.
a number of
It's a
court
direct
cases
result
to really
of
hammer this
explicit
home.
government
For example, he
policies at the
discusses
federal,
the 1974
the
Milliken
state,
v. Bradley
Mhm.
case,
and the local
which
levels.
focused on
Wow,
Detroit's
that's a huge
deeply
statement.
segregated school
So
system.
how
The
did the
Supreme Court
government
ruled
actually
that the
actively
segregation
segregate
there
America?
wasn't a
What kind of
result of
policies
an
are we talking about
explicit
here?
government
Well,
policy,
Rothstein lays out a
and
whole bunch
therefore
of
it couldn't
tactics
be
that were
remedied
used,
by a
and some of them were
desegregation plan that
shockingly
involved the
overt. I mean,
surrounding
like racial
mostly white
zoning, for
suburbs.
instance.
So even though the
In the
outcome
early
was
20th
clearly
century, cities could
segregated
actually
schools,
just pass laws
the court
that
said
dictated where
it's not the
people of
government's
different
fault.
races could
Precisely.
live. Like literally
And
on
Rothstein
which blocks
argues
they could
that
live.
this
It's
reliance on the
unbelievable.
idea of
So
de
they could
facto
really just make it
segregation
illegal for a
was a
black
critical
family to live
error.
in a certain
It
neighborhood
allowed
if
the
they wanted
government
to?
to avoid
Basically, yes.
responsibility for
But
fixing
of course,
a
like with
problem
so
that
many
it had a
things in
hand
history, the
creating.
implementation
This really highlights
wasn't
how
always
important
straightforward.
language
You know,
can
he
be.
talks about
The
Baltimore as
terms
an
we use to
example.
describe things, they're not just
Baltimore really
academic
struggled
distinctions.
to
They have
apply their
huge
racial
real-world
zoning
consequences.
ordinance.
Absolutely.
In
Rothstein is
areas that
very
were
intentional
already
about his language
integrated.
throughout
Oh,
the
right.
book.
So they
For
actually
example,
had
he
to revise
consistently
the
uses the
ordinance
word
to
ghetto
only
to
apply to
describe
blocks that were
segregated
entirely
black
white or
neighborhoods.
entirely
He
black.
argues that this
Wow.
term
So you can see the
accurately reflects the
contradictions and the
state
imposed isolation and deprivation faced by these communities.
It's a stark reminder that segregation wasn't just about where people lived. It was about unequal access to opportunity, to resources, to a fair chance at a good life.
Exactly. And that leads us to the heart of the book, the specific examples of government-sanctioned segregation that he uncovers. These stories bring the history to life, and they make the lasting impacts of these policies impossible to ignore.
Okay, I'm ready to dive into those examples. Where do we start?
Well, he covers a lot of ground, but some of the most impactful areas involve racial zoning, federal housing programs, public housing projects, even things like the construction of highways and urban renewal initiatives.
Wow, so it wasn't just a few bad policies here and there. It sounds like a whole web of interconnected actions, all with the same goal, keeping people separated by race.
Exactly. And as we explore these examples, you'll see that these policies weren't just theoretical. They had devastating consequences for real people, consequences that we're still wrestling with today.
Right, lead the way. I'm ready to learn more. So we've seen how deeply ingrained this idea of separating people by race was in our legal system. But how did that actually play out in real life? Where do we see these policies in action?
Well, Rothstein walks us through a whole array of discriminatory practices, and it's honestly shocking how blatant some of them were. Like, take racial zoning, for example. In the early 20th century, cities like Baltimore and St. Louis had ordinances that straight up forbade black families from moving onto blocks where white families were the majority.
It's hard to believe that was ever legal. It's just so explicitly discriminatory.
It is, and the Supreme Court actually struck down those explicitly racial zoning ordinances in 1917 with the Buchanan v. Worley case. But as Rothstein points out, cities quickly found workarounds to achieve the same outcome.
That's disheartening, but not surprising, sadly. What kind of loopholes did they exploit?
They turned to what they called economic zoning. They'd designate certain areas for single-family homes, knowing that these would be too expensive for most lower-income families who were disproportionately black. Or they'd use zoning to block the construction of multifamily units, which would provide more affordable housing options.
So on the surface, it wasn't about race, but in practice, it had the same effect.
Exactly. And this pattern, using policies that were racially neutral on paper but discriminatory in effect, pops up again and again throughout the book. It's a constant reminder of how insidious these practices were.
Okay, so racial zoning, even in its disguised forms, played a significant role in creating these segregated neighborhoods. What other examples does Rothstein bring to light?
One area that had a huge impact and might surprise some people is federal housing policies, particularly those implemented during the New Deal era.
When I think of the New Deal, I think of programs designed to help people, to lift them out of poverty. Not exactly policies that would increase segregation.
That was certainly the stated goal of many New Deal programs, but as Rothstein reveals, many of them were designed in ways that actually reinforced and even exacerbated existing segregation.
That's unsettling.
Yeah.
What were some of those policies? How did they end up doing the opposite of what they intended?
Let's take the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC, as an example. This agency was created to help prevent homeowners from losing their homes to foreclosure during the Great Depression. Seems like a good thing, right?
On the face of it, absolutely. Helping people keep their homes is a worthy goal.
The problem was in how they went about assessing risk. To determine which neighborhoods were safe investments for loans, the HOLC created these color-coded maps of neighborhoods across the country. And you can probably guess what happened. Neighborhoods with black residents were almost always marked in red, designated as hazardous for investment.
Wait, so black families were denied loans simply because of where they lived, regardless of their individual financial situation?
That's right. And it gets worse. These maps weren't just some internal document. Banks and other lenders used them extensively, effectively locking black families out of homeownership opportunities in desirable neighborhoods, the same neighborhoods deemed safe for white borrowers.
That's just infuriating.
Yeah.
It's hard to believe that something as basic as buying a home could be so blatantly manipulated to disadvantage an entire group of people.
And it wasn't just the HOLC. Rothstein points to the Federal Housing Administration, or FHA, as another key player in the system. They actively promoted restrictive covenants, which were clauses written into property deeds that explicitly barred black families from purchasing homes in certain predominantly white neighborhoods.
So it's not just that the government allowed segregation to happen. They were actually incentivizing and enforcing it.
Exactly. Rothstein illustrates this point with a particularly striking example from the book, Levittown.
Oh yeah, Levittown. Those idyllic post-war suburbs that were supposed to represent the American dream, right? Affordable homes for returning veterans.
That's the image they projected, but the reality was far more exclusionary. Levittown explicitly prohibited black buyers from purchasing homes, and this discrimination was fully backed by the FHA. Rothstein shares the story of the Merriday family whose members had actually worked on the construction of Levittown, but were then denied the opportunity to buy a home there simply because they were black.
That's incredibly heartbreaking. It just underscores how these policies were not just abstract concepts. They had real devastating consequences for individual families and entire communities.
And the impact of these policies extended beyond the private housing market. They also shaped the development of public housing projects.
I always thought public housing was supposed to be a solution, a way to ensure everyone had access to safe and affordable housing regardless of race or income.
That was the initial vision, but it quickly went astray. While public housing was initially conceived of as integrated government policies at the local and federal levels led to stark segregation. Black families were often concentrated in urban ghettos, while white families were placed in more desirable locations.
So even when there was a chance for integrated housing, the government stepped in to make sure that didn't happen.
It's a tragic pattern, and Rothstein provides ample evidence to support this claim. He even mentions how after World War II, the government demolished integrated war worker housing, further displacing black families into already overcrowded neighborhoods.
It's like every step of the way, there was a deliberate effort to keep people separated.
And Rothstein's research reveals another layer to this story. Even some officials who believed in integration, even those who considered themselves liberal, often chose to perpetuate segregation out of fear. They were afraid of losing crucial funding or political support if they pushed for integration too forcefully.
The classic example of choosing the path of least resistance, even when that path leads to injustice.
And that same pattern can be seen in the destruction of vibrant black communities to make way for highway construction. Interstate highways were frequently routed through black neighborhoods, displacing residents and businesses with little to no compensation or assistance in relocating.
Wait, so highways were actually used as tools of segregation?
In many cases, yes, Rothstein argues that this wasn't simply an unintended consequence. He cites examples where highway planners explicitly targeted black communities for demolition, seeing them as expendable. The concept of slum clearance, often used to justify these projects, was disproportionately applied to black neighborhoods, furthering the cycle of displacement and disinvestment.
It's mind-boggling how these seemingly unrelated policies, housing, transportation, zoning, all work together to create and reinforce segregation.
And what's even more disturbing is that this wasn't just a historical phenomenon. Rothstein makes it clear that these policies have had a lasting impact, an impact that continues to shape racial inequality in America today.
Okay, I think we need to delve into those consequences now. How are we still feeling the effects of these policies generations later?
The book explores a wide range of impacts, but some of the most prominent include the staggering wealth gap between black and white families, persistent educational inequality, the concentration of poverty in minority communities, and the limited access to opportunity that so many black Americans still face. These are issues that touch every aspect of American life and have deep historical roots.
It's a stark reminder that the past is never truly past. It continues to reverberate in the present.
Exactly. And Rothstein doesn't just lay out the problems, he also offers potential solutions for dismantling the legacy of segregation. But before we get to those, I think it's important to really understand the full scope of the problem, how these policies continue to play out in the present.
All right, let's do that. Let's dig deeper into the lasting consequences of these segregating policies. It's hard to even wrap your head around the sheer scale of it all, right? How these policies enacted decades ago could have such a ripple effect impacting generations of people. So let's talk about some of the most tangible ways we see those consequences playing out today.
Well, one of the most glaring consequences, and one that just keeps coming up, is the massive wealth gap between black and white families. And Rothstein really connects this back to those discriminatory housing policies we talked about. When black families were systematically denied access to home ownership in those desirable neighborhoods, they were essentially cut off from generations of wealth accumulation.
Yeah, that makes sense. Home ownership is often like the biggest driver of wealth for families, especially middle-class families. And if you're locked out of that, the effects just kind of cascade down through generations.
Moving and going. Black families missed out on the chance to benefit from things like rising property values, to build equity that they could then pass down to their children. It's a lost legacy that continues to shape everything from educational attainment to access to healthcare and economic opportunities.
And it's not just about housing, though, right? Rothstein also talks about how other policies, like those related to taxes and the labor market, really compounded these problems.
Absolutely. He points out how discriminatory tax policies often placed a heavier burden on Black communities, making it even harder for families to build wealth. And then in the job market, Black workers were often stuck in these lower paying jobs with fewer benefits, further limiting their economic mobility.
So it's like every system was stacked against them, making it almost impossible to really get ahead.
And those systemic barriers, those were built by deliberate policies. They haven't magically vanished. They continue to shape the landscape of opportunity in America. Even today, Black families are more likely to live in neighborhoods with higher poverty rates, lower performing schools, fewer job opportunities. It's a cycle that's really hard to break.
It feels almost impossible at times. So what does Rothstein propose we do about this? Is there any way to undo the damage that's been done?
Well, he's very clear about this. We need a comprehensive approach, a real national commitment to dismantling this legacy of segregation. He advocates for things like inclusionary zoning, which would require developers to set aside a certain percentage of units in new developments for affordable housing.
So that would help ensure that lower-income families who are disproportionately Black have a chance to live in neighborhoods with better resources and better opportunities.
That's the idea. He also supports expanding the use of housing vouchers like Section 8 to help families afford to live in these higher opportunity neighborhoods. Essentially, he's pushing for policies that promote genuine choice and genuine mobility for all families.
These sound like promising solutions, but I can only imagine there's a lot of resistance to implementing them, especially in more affluent communities.
Oh, you're absolutely right. He acknowledges that these solutions are not going to be easy to put into practice. They require a real shift in mindset, a willingness to confront these uncomfortable truths about our past and how that past continues to shape the world we live in today.
It sounds like he's calling for a fundamental change in how we think about housing and opportunity in America, not just kind of tweaking things around the edges.
Exactly. He challenges us to see segregation not as some abstract problem from some bygone era, but as a moral imperative that demands action right now.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We talked about the historical roots of segregation, the specific policies that created it, and the lasting consequences that we still see today. What would you say is the most important takeaway from The Color of Law?
I think the most powerful message, and the one that really sticks with me, is this. Segregation was not an accident. It was a deliberate creation of government policy. And because of that, we as a society have a responsibility to repair the damage that's been done.
It's not enough to just acknowledge the wrongs of the past, right? We actually have to do something about it.
We have to take concrete steps to create a more just and equitable future for everyone.
And I think that starts with really understanding the truth about how we got here. Rothstein's book is an incredibly powerful tool for raising awareness and for sparking honest conversations about this legacy of segregation.
It's a challenge to all of us to confront these truths even when they're uncomfortable and to work towards a more just society.
Well, this deep dive has certainly been eye-opening, and I'll be honest, pretty unsettling. It's challenged a lot of what I thought I knew about this history of segregation in America.
It's definitely a must-read for anyone who really wants to understand the true roots of racial inequality in this country.
Yeah, it's not always an easy read, but it's an absolutely essential one. It forces us to confront our nation's past and really grapple with how that past continues to affect our present.
And on that note, we'll leave you with a question to ponder. Knowing what we now know about the intentional creation of segregated America, what is our responsibility in dismantling its legacy? What will we do with this knowledge?
That's a really powerful question, and one that I think deserves our full attention. We can't afford to be passive bystanders on this. The future of our nation really depends on our willingness to face this challenge head-on. So thank you for joining us on this deep dive into The Color of Law. It's been a heavy conversation, but an incredibly important one. Until next time, keep diving.